So before I can talk about racism, I need to really establish a definition for race and to make sure that we are on the same page when we talk about race. Race, in my mind, is just a proxy for colorism. It is a proxy for discriminating against people based on their color. Race is a social construction, not a biological construction, but it has biological consequences. It has biological consequences because the stress of racism impacts people's health. Some people will want to argue that there is only one race, the human race. And they're absolutely true. I mean, that's absolutely true. There is only one race, the human race, in that sense. But just like words have multiple definitions, race has another definition, and that definition goes to how we have categorized people on color. Now, saying that there's only one race is about as meaningful as saying that there's only one world. In fact, when you think about it, there is only one world. And yet, we have these social political constructions called countries. And these social political constructions have meaning. No one would argue that the United States of America doesn't have an impact on the whole world that is separate and different from Kenya, Japan, Great Britain, Brazil, which are social political construction that did not exist thousands of years ago and will not exist thousands of years from now. And yet, at this moment in time in our history, the geopolitical construction called the United States of America has enormous power and consequences on others. That's the same way we have to think about race. That yes, we're all one human race, but we also have divided ourselves, or have been divided historically by skin color, and that social construction, which is also called race, has consequences. Now, one of the problems that we get into when we talk about race is that people want to make a class comparison to show that race is not an issue. How does that go? Well, people will say, oh, there's no race problems. Look, middle-class black Americans are doing much better than poor blacks. So there can't be a race problem if you have all these middle-class black Americans. See, that's a class analysis, not a race analysis. Class, you control for race, and you look at how poor blacks are doing compared to middle-class blacks. And yes, class is very important. In fact, I mean, there's no hierarchy between class and race. One is not more important or less important. They both have their own impact, and you have to address them both. And as a upper middle class black woman, at this moment, I am doing better than a poor black woman, because class makes a difference. Having said that, though, that doesn't mean that race doesn't make a difference as well. And to get at race, what you do is control for class by comparing people of the same class but different race. So the question is, Not whether I'm doing better than poor blacks. Am I doing as well as middle class whites? And study after study in every area, wealth, income, education, uh, housing, environment, criminal, just every area, middle class blacks are doing worse than middle class whites. Understanding that race is really, it has two, to me, two definitional approaches. One is it's used to identify groups that experience either racism or privilege. So whites, which is a race, experience a privilege because of their skin color. Blacks experience deprivation because of their skin color, and race is the term that we use to identify that. And so racism is about subordination. It's about power, and it's about group. We tend to want group subordination, not just individual subordination. And that's real important because we tend to want to deal with individual subordination in terms of curing the problem, in terms of remedies, without looking at the group subordination. Institutional racism, which is, there's individual racism and cultural racism and systemic racism and institutional racism, which I think is the primary form of colorblind racism, not the only form, it's no longer about individual racism. It's about the use of procedures and practices and patterns to perpetuate and maintain white privilege. And so, as we go through this discussion about colorblind racism, remember there can be colorblind institutional racism. In fact, what I'd say is that most institutional racism is colorblind initially. Eventually, I think it's overt because once they know about it, they authorize it by continuing to do the practices, even though they know it's. Here's another way to look at this issue of racism and how it plays out. So, one of the problems we have is distinguishing stereotypes, biases, and prejudice from discrimination. And it's important because everybody has stereotypes. Everybody has stereotypes of somebody, some group, and biases and prejudices. However, those stereotypes, biases, and prejudices do not have to translate in discrimination. That is where you treat someone different or a group different because of group membership. Now, discrimination can be intentional. That is, you can decide that you want to discriminate against this group. It can be reckless. That is, you don't really want to discriminate against an individual or group, but there's a very high risk that you are going to discriminate against the group and you don't do anything to correct that. That's reckless. It can be negligent discrimination. That is, you don't want to discriminate. The risk may not be really high that you can discriminate, but the reasonable person or the reasonable company would not discriminate. They would put patterns of behavior into action so that they do not discriminate. You didn't do that. you proceeded to act in a way that discriminate. Now, negligent discrimination is about you knew or you should have known, and the should have known is the important part. If you should have known that your behavior, your actions were going to result in discrimination, and you should have corrected it. Strict discrimination is that discrimination where we decide as a society that certain kinds of discrimination is completely unacceptable. We don't care what your frame of mind was. If you do the discrimination, you're going to be responsible for it no matter what your discrimination mind is. Having laid that out, when we look at this chart, what we see is that there's the non-racist, the person or institution who has no stereotypes, no biases, and no prejudice, and they also do not discriminate. I don't think that person exists, and I don't think that institution exists, because I think institutions are people, and people have stereotypes, biases, and prejudices. I think that the denial of the existence of stereotypes, bias, and prejudice is one of the underlying causes of discrimination. The reform racists are whether individual or institution, is the person who recognizes that they have stereotype, biases, and prejudice, but they actively work on non-discrimination. That is, in their daily personal life, in their institutional life, they review policies constantly to be sure that they're not having a disparate impact on any group, on African Americans. And you can be in that group. I put myself in that group because I clearly have stereotypes and biases, and I have to watch. And I've become much better at it as I've grown older, because my brain has become programmed to be sensitive to when other people are beginning to engage in discrimination and stereotype, bias, and prejudice talk, and not to engage in it myself, and to look for, I actively look for, am I doing my job in a way that is non-discriminatory. Now, the old-fashioned racist has stereotypes, biases, and prejudice amidst to them, and they also discriminate. Part of the problem with our legal system is that we've only recognized intentional discrimination, and so that the old-fashioned racist was only considered those who intentionally discriminate. We never considered reckless, negligent, and strict discrimination. The colorblind racist is the person who believes that they have no stereotype, biases, or prejudice, but is quite willing to discriminate so long as they don't do it intentionally. They're happy they'll do it recklessly, they do it negligently, and as long as it's not intentional, they do not believe that they have engaged in racist behavior. Now, I would call into question their belief system that they have no stereotypes, biases, and prejudices. But even if you accept their claim that they have no stereotypes, biases, and prejudices, their discrimination is still unacceptable. And particularly the reckless and negligent kind, which is the predominant kind of discrimination that is occurring in the 21st century.